What became of the millions of young men and women who were shaped, indoctrinated, and ultimately consumed by the Hitler Youth, one of the most powerful and sinister youth movements in modern history? When the guns fell silent in May 1945 and the Third Reich lay in ruins, more than 8 million young Germans found themselves stranded in the wreckage of a world they had been raised to conquer. Some had spent their entire adolescence marching in lockstep with an ideology that had dragged the world into catastrophe. Others had been handed rifles and told to die for a cause already lost, and a handful had dared to resist, paying for their defiance with their lives. The Hitler Youth was not merely a scouting organization or a youth club. It was a machine designed to produce fanatical warriors, ideologically committed soldiers, and obedient servants of a racial state. At its height, membership was not just encouraged but legally compulsory. To understand what happened to these young people after the war, we must first understand just how deeply the Third Reich had sunk its claws into the lives and minds of Germany's children. And what we find in this video is a story that is by turns tragic, astonishing, and profoundly complicated. We will follow the fates of the organization's leaders, its most zealous members, its most famous alumni, and the ordinary boys and girls who emerged from 1945, blinking into a ruined world, trying to figure out who they were when the uniforms were stripped away. So, without further ado, let's start with the very beginning of this story. The Hitler Youth, known in German as the Hitler Jugend, or simply the HJ, had its roots in the earliest days of the National Socialist movement. Founded in 1922, it began as a small paramilitary organization for young men between the ages of 14 and 18, designed to serve as a feeder organization for the Sturmabteilung, the infamous SA, or Brown Shirts. In those early years, it was little more than a street-level political gang in short trousers, but its ambitions and its methods would grow enormously over the following 2 decades. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, the Hitler Youth was rapidly transformed into something far more ambitious. Under the energetic leadership of Baldur von Schirach, the organization expanded at an extraordinary rate, absorbing or banning all rival youth movements across Germany. By 1933, there were just over 2 million members. By 1936, that number had swelled to 5 million. By 1939, on the eve of the war that would consume a generation, membership stood at over 8 million young Germans. For boys aged 14 to 18, the Hitler Jugend proper was the destination, but the ideological pipeline began far earlier. Boys between 10 and 14 served in the Deutsches Jungvolk, the German young people, where they were drilled in Nazi ideology, physical fitness, and the rudiments of military discipline. Girls between 10 and 14 joined the Jungmädelbund, the League of Young Girls, before graduating at 14, to the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, or BDM, where they were trained in domestic arts, physical fitness, and their role as future mothers of the master race. The philosophy underpinning the entire organization was captured in a phrase attributed to Hitler himself: "Youth must be led by youth." The idea was that young people would be most effectively shaped by their peers, under the supervision of slightly older HJ leaders who were themselves barely out of childhood. This created an environment of intense peer pressure, conformity, and ideological reinforcement. To dissent was not merely to be different, it was to be a traitor. And the consequences of dissent were made very clear from early on. By the time the Second World War began in September 1939, the Hitler Youth had become one of the defining institutions of German society. Its members had been raised to believe that they were part of a racially superior nation destined for greatness, that the Jews were enemies of civilization, that the nations of Europe were weak and decadent, and that Germany's destiny was written in blood and conquest. These were not fringe beliefs whispered in dark corners. They were the daily currency of school, of family life, of the radio, of the cinema, and above all of the Hitler Youth itself. Camping trips combined physical endurance tests with lectures on racial theory. Songs around the campfire glorified sacrifice for the fatherland. Military drills were presented as adventure and excitement. The psychological conditioning was extraordinarily thorough, and for many of the young people who passed through the organization, it left marks that would take decades to erase if they could be erased at all. But as the war ground on, the Hitler Youth's role shifted from ideological training to something far more brutal. As German manpower was consumed on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually, in Normandy, the organization's older members were funneled directly into the SS and the Wehrmacht. By 1943, entire divisions were being formed from Hitler Youth members barely old enough to shave. By 1944, children as young as 15 and 16 were being handed anti-tank weapons and told to hold the line against the armies of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain. By the spring of 1945, in the dying weeks of the Third Reich, boys as young as 12 and 13 were being sent into combat in the ruins of Berlin. The story of what happened to these young people in war and in peace is one of the most extraordinary and haunting chapters of the entire Second World War. In this video, we will find out exactly what became of them, so let us begin with the man most responsible for building this formidable machine, the man who served as the Reich youth leader for most of the organization's existence, Baldur von Schirach, Baldur Benedict. Von Schirach was born on May 9, 1907 in Berlin, into a family with deep cultural roots and, perhaps surprisingly, strong American connections. His mother, Henrietta Hoffmann, was an American citizen of partial German descent, and his father, Karl von Schirach, had served as a theatre director and had connections to the artistic and cultural elite of Wilhelmina, Germany. This background gave Baldur a certain polish, an intellectual veneer that distinguished him from the rougher elements of the early Nazi movement. He was an aesthete, a lover of poetry, music and literature, which made his commitment to the brutalities of Nazism all the more troubling in retrospect. Von Schirach joined the Nazi Party in 1925 at the age of 18 and quickly rose to prominence as a speaker and organizer. He had a gift for rhetoric, a handsome appearance, and an obvious talent for inspiring young people with visions of national renewal and racial destiny. Hitler recognized these gifts and in 1931 appointed him as the Reich youth leader of the NSDAP, a position that would soon become the most powerful youth leadership role in German history. When Hitler came to power in 1933, von Schirach was given control of all German youth organizations, which he consolidated ruthlessly into the Hitler Youth. By 1936, when the Hitler Youth Law made membership compulsory for all German boys, von Schirach was the undisputed master of Germany's next generation. He lived lavishly, surrounded himself with cultural figures, and cultivated an image as a sophisticated idealist rather than a simple-minded thug. But behind the cultural pretensions lay a man deeply committed to Nazi ideology, including its virulent anti-Semitism. In 1940, von Schirach was appointed Gauleiter and Reich Governor of Vienna, one of the most powerful regional positions in the Nazi state. In this role, he was responsible for the deportation of over 65,000 Viennese Jews to concentration camps and killing sites in the occupied East. Whatever cultural refinement he claimed for himself, the blood of tens of thousands of innocent people was on his hands. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, von Schirach did not attempt to flee. He surrendered to American forces and was brought before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the great reckoning that would attempt to deliver justice to the architects of the most terrible war in human history. The Nuremberg prosecutors were thorough in laying out the charges against him. He faced counts of crimes against humanity for his role in the deportation of Jews from Vienna. His defense team argued that he had acted within the bounds of his official duties and had not been aware of the ultimate fate awaiting the deportees. It was the kind of defense that the Nuremberg judges heard many times, and they rejected it with equal firmness. On October 1, 1946, Baldur von Schirach was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin, the heavily guarded facility that also housed Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and a handful of other prominent war criminals. Life at Spandau was monotonous and rigidly controlled. The prisoners were permitted limited correspondence, restricted reading materials, and brief periods of outdoor exercise. Von Schirach spent much of his long imprisonment writing, reflecting, and eventually arriving at a very public repudiation of his former idol. In 1966, as he prepared for his release, he published a memoir titled Ich glaubte an Hitler, or I Believed in Hitler, a title that captured both the depth of his former devotion and the distance he claimed to have travelled. Whether this repentance was genuine or calculated is a question that historians have debated ever since. What is clear is that upon his release from Spandau on September 30th, 1966, exactly 20 years after his sentencing, von Schirach was a broken and largely forgotten figure. He lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity in West Germany, giving occasional interviews and writing occasional pieces, but never regaining any public standing. The man who had once commanded the loyalty of millions of German children died on August 8, 1974, in Kreuve, in the Mosel wine country, aged 67. He is remembered today chiefly as the man who built the machine that consumed a generation, a legacy he could never escape no matter how many words of remorse he committed to paper. When von Schirach was transferred to the governorship of Vienna in 1940, his successor as Reich youth leader was a man who embodied the Hitler Youth in a far more visceral and uncompromising way. Arthur Axmann was born on February 18, 1913, in Hagen in Westphalia, and unlike the genteel von Schirach, there was nothing of the aesthete about him. Axmann was a movement man through and through, a true believer whose commitment to National Socialism burned with an intensity that never really dimmed even through the catastrophe of Germany's total defeat. He had joined the Hitler Youth in 1928 at the age of 15, barely 2 years after the organization was formally constituted, and he had risen rapidly through its ranks on the strength of his organizing ability, his personal charisma, and his utter ideological reliability. By 1940, when he took over from von Schirach, Axmann was 27 years old and already a hardened Nazi veteran. The timing of his appointment was significant. Germany was at the height of its power, its armies sweeping across Western Europe in a series of campaigns that seemed to vindicate everything the regime had promised. The Hitler Youth, under Axmann's direction, began to take on an increasingly military character, with more emphasis on weapons training, ideological hardening, and preparation for combat service. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Axmann himself went to the Eastern Front, where he served with the Wehrmacht and lost his right arm in combat. He was decorated for bravery and returned to his leadership role, where his combat experience gave him additional authority with the increasingly militarized HJ. As the war turned against Germany after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943, Axmann threw himself into the task of channeling Hitler Youth members into the war effort. He was instrumental in the creation of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, one of the most ferocious fighting formations of the entire conflict, which we will discuss in detail shortly. He also oversaw the deployment of HJ members in anti-aircraft roles, in civil defense, in agricultural labor, and eventually in direct combat as German manpower reserves were exhausted. By 1945, Axmann was sending children barely into their teenage years to their deaths in defense of a regime that had already lost everything, but had not yet admitted it. The final days of the Third Reich brought Axmann to his most notorious moment. He was present in the Führer bunker in Berlin during the last weeks of April 1945, one of the dwindling circle of true believers who remained at Hitler's side as Soviet forces closed in on the city. On April 30th, 1945, after Hitler's suicide, Axmann was part of the breakout group that attempted to escape from Berlin through the Soviet lines. During this attempt, he came across the body of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, lying in the street near the Weidendammer Bridge. Whether Bormann was dead at that moment, or whether he died shortly afterward, has been a matter of controversy for decades. But Axmann's account of seeing the body remained one of the key pieces of evidence in debates about Bormann's fate. Axmann himself managed to escape from Berlin and went into hiding. He was eventually captured by American forces in December 1945 in Bavaria, living under a false identity in a mountain village. At a denazification court in 1949, he was sentenced to 3 years and 3 months of hard labor, a sentence that many observers felt was absurdly lenient given his role in sending thousands of teenage boys to their deaths. He served his time and was released, and went on to live a remarkably normal life by the standards of former Nazi functionaries. He ran a sales promotion business in West Berlin and appeared to have little difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. He was tried again by a West German court in 1958 and fined 35,000 Deutsche Marks for his role in Nazi activities, but faced no further legal consequences. Arthur Axmann, the man who had commanded 8 million young Germans and sent tens of thousands of teenagers to their deaths in Hitler's last battles, died on October 24, 1996, in Berlin, aged 83. He had outlived the Third Reich by more than half a century, and he never publicly expressed anything resembling genuine remorse for the role he had played in destroying so many young lives. If there is a single military formation that encapsulates the transformation of the Hitler Youth from a youth movement into a killing machine, it is the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This unit was formed in 1943 on the direct initiative of Arthur Axmann and senior SS commanders who recognized that the pool of older recruits was drying up and that the next generation would have to be thrown into the fight. The division was composed primarily of 17-year-old volunteers drawn directly from the Hitler Youth, paired with a cadre of experienced NCOs and officers drawn from the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The combination proved devastating. These young men, fanatically indoctrinated and militarily trained, proved to be among the most formidable and the most ruthless fighters in the entire German order of battle. The division first went into action in Normandy in June 1944, following the Allied landings on D-Day, and it immediately made its mark in the most appalling way. On June 8, 1944, just 2 days after the landings, soldiers of the Hitlerjugend Division executed 44 Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbaye d'Ardennes near Caen. The prisoners had been captured during the fierce fighting around the beachhead and were shot in cold blood on the orders of the divisional commander. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of atrocities committed by the division throughout the Normandy campaign, a pattern that reflected both the fanaticism of its personnel and the culture of violence that the Hitler Youth had instilled in its members from childhood. The man most closely associated with these crimes was SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, known to his men as Panzer Meyer, who commanded the division during the Normandy campaign. Meyer was a veteran SS officer who embodied the hardness and ruthlessness that the SS prized above all other virtues. Born on December 23, 1910, in Yerxheim in Lower Saxony, he had joined the SS in 1931 and had fought in Poland, France, Greece and on the Eastern Front before taking command of the Hitlerjugend Division. Under his command, the division fought with extraordinary tenacity throughout the summer of 1944, holding up the Allied advance through Normandy far longer than any reasonable military calculation might have suggested possible. The young men of the division were not merely fighting well, they were fighting as if they genuinely had nothing to lose, which in a very real sense they did, having been raised since childhood to believe that death in battle was the greatest honour available to a German man. But the fanaticism that made them effective fighters also made them capable of extraordinary brutality. The murder of Canadian prisoners at Abbaye d'Ardennes was among the first and most documented, but it was far from the last. As Germany retreated through France, Belgium and the Netherlands, the division's soldiers continued to commit atrocities against prisoners and civilians with a consistency that made post-war prosecution inevitable. Kurt Meyer was captured by Belgian resistance fighters in September 1944 and was eventually tried by a Canadian military court at Aurich in December 1945. He was found guilty of inciting and permitting the murder of Canadian prisoners and sentenced to death by firing squad. However, his sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment, a decision that outraged many Canadian veterans and the families of the murdered prisoners. Meyer served his sentence at Werl prison in West Germany and was released in September 1954, after serving just 9 years. His release sparked considerable controversy in Canada, where his crimes were well remembered. Back in West Germany, Meyer published his memoirs and became a minor celebrity among veterans organizations, presenting himself as a professional soldier who had fought honorably in difficult circumstances. He died on December 23, 1961, in Hagen on his 51st birthday. His story encapsulates many of the tensions of post-war Germany, the pressure to move on, to reintegrate former Nazis into society, to draw a line under the past set against the demands of justice and the memories of the victims. The ordinary soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division who survived the war faced a range of fates. Many were captured by Allied forces, interned in prisoner of war camps, and eventually released after denazification proceedings. Some faced specific war crimes charges, but the majority were processed and released, returning to civilian life in a shattered country where the pressures of rebuilding tended to overwhelm the impulse to hold every former soldier accountable. For these young men, most of whom had been teenagers when they joined and who had known nothing but war and National Socialist ideology, the transition to peacetime was deeply disorienting. They had been told that their cause was righteous, that their enemies were subhuman, that sacrifice and obedience were the highest virtues. In 1945, they discovered that everything they had been taught was at best a lie, and at worst a prelude to a genocide. Processing that realization took, for many of them, a lifetime. The most dramatic and most tragic expression of the Hitler Youth's total mobilization for war came in the final battle for Berlin in April 1945. By this point, the war was undeniably and irretrievably lost. Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov had crossed the Oder River and were driving toward the German capital with the full weight of their massive armies. American and British forces were advancing from the west. Germany was squeezed from every direction, its cities in ruins, its transport networks destroyed, its population exhausted and terrified. And yet, in the ruins of Berlin, Arthur Axmann mobilized the last remaining Hitler Youth members to fight what everyone with eyes could see was a hopeless battle. Boys as young as 12 were drafted into Volkssturm units and given Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets to use against Soviet armor. They were dressed in uniforms that were often too large for their slight frames, given minimal training, and sent to man barricades and anti-tank positions throughout the city. The courage, or the conditioned fearlessness, of many of these boys was extraordinary. Reports from Soviet commanders described astonishment at encountering children in uniform who fought with a ferocity that belied their youth. But courage and fanaticism were no substitutes for military experience or adequate equipment, and the boys died in enormous numbers. Exact casualty figures from this period are impossible to establish with precision, but estimates suggest that thousands of Hitler Youth members were killed in the final weeks of April 1945 in Berlin and its approaches. Others were captured, some were wounded and left to die in field hospitals that were themselves under fire, and a significant number simply disappeared into the chaos of the collapsing city, discarding their uniforms and attempting to pass as civilians. One of the most documented and most haunting aspects of the Berlin fighting was the deployment of Hitler Youth members as tank hunters. Armed with Panzerfausts, these boys were ordered to approach Soviet tanks at close range, fire their single-shot rockets, and then rely on the chaos of battle to escape. The tactic was sometimes effective in terms of destroying Soviet armor, but it was suicidal for the boys involved. Photographs taken during this period show children with SS runes on their collars receiving medals from an elderly Adolf Hitler in the garden of the Reich Chancellery just days before his suicide. One of the most famous of these photographs shows Hitler patting the cheek of a boy who appears to be no more than 12 years old. This image has come to encapsulate everything that was perverse about the final days of the Third Reich, the willingness of the Nazi leadership to consume its youngest and most innocent members in defense of a cause already beyond saving. The fate of the Berlin Hitler Youth fighters was grim. Those who survived the fighting faced the immediate terror of Soviet occupation, which was accompanied by widespread violence against the German civilian population. Many of the boys who had fought so ferociously to defend the city were now at the mercy of the armies they had been trying to stop. Some were captured and sent to Soviet prisoner of war camps, where conditions were brutal and death rates were high. Others merged into the civilian population as quickly as possible, attempting to hide any evidence of their military service. The psychological consequences of these experiences were severe and lasting, and would shape the lives of survivors for decades to come. The story of the Hitler Youth cannot be told without also telling the story of those who refused. Not every German young person accepted the regime's demands with obedience and enthusiasm. Across Germany, small groups of young people found ways, often at great personal risk, to resist the suffocating conformity of the Hitler Youth. Perhaps the most famous of these was the White Rose, a small resistance group based at the University of Munich that took its name from the rose petals they used to decorate their anonymous leaflets denouncing the Nazi regime. At the heart of the White Rose were a brother and sister whose courage and conviction would make them among the most celebrated figures in the history of German resistance. Hans Scholl was born on September 22, 1918 in Ingersheim an der Enns, the son of a liberal city mayor who opposed Nazism and paid for his dissent with repeated harassment and eventual imprisonment. Hans himself had initially been an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth in the early 1930s, drawn by the excitement and camaraderie of the movement before the scales fell from his eyes. By the late 1930s, he had become a secret member of the Bündische Jugend, the banned independent youth movements that the Hitler Youth had suppressed, and his disillusionment with Nazism was complete. His sister Sophie Scholl, born on May 9, 1921, underwent a similar journey of disenchantment. Both had been members of the Hitler Youth and the BDM in their early teenage years, and both had come to see the regime for what it was. When Hans entered the University of Munich in 1942 and was confronted with first-hand accounts of the mass murder of Jews in the East, the transformation into active resistance was complete. The White Rose distributed 6 series of leaflets between June 1942 and February 1943, calling on Germans to resist the Nazi regime and predicting accurately that the war was already lost. The leaflets were remarkable for their clarity, their moral courage, and their sophisticated political arguments. They reached thousands of readers across Germany and beyond, and their authors knew that discovery meant death. That death came on February 18th. 1943, when Hans and Sophie were caught distributing leaflets at the University of Munich by a building janitor who reported them to the Gestapo. They were arrested, interrogated, tried before the People's Court under the ferocious Roland Freisler, who screamed at them during the trial in his characteristic style, and sentenced to death. Hans Scholl was 24 years old. Sophie Scholl was 21. They were executed by guillotine on February 22, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, along with their fellow White Rose member, Christoph Probst. Their deaths shocked even those within Germany who had become inured to Nazi brutality, and their memory became, in the post-war decades, one of the central elements of a German narrative of wartime resistance, a counter-narrative to the story of universal complicity and collaboration. Today, Hans and Sophie Scholl are commemorated throughout Germany, with streets, schools and public spaces bearing their names. Their refusal to conform stands as a permanent rebuke to the idea that the Hitler Youth succeeded in producing nothing but fanatical obedience. Another form of youth resistance that was less philosophically articulate but no less courageous was embodied by the Edelweiss Pirates, a loose network of working-class youth gangs that sprang up across the industrial cities of the Rhine and Ruhr regions in the late 1930s and spread throughout the war years. The Edelweiss Pirates, who took their name from the small white alpine flower they wore as a badge, were not a formal political organization. They had no manifesto, no central leadership, and no clear ideological program. What they had was a refusal to be told what to do, a rejection of the regimented uniformity of the Hitler Youth, and a willingness to express that refusal in increasingly dangerous ways. The pirates organized camping trips and hiking expeditions that parodied and mocked the Hitler Youth's own outdoor activities. They sang banned songs, wore their own distinctive dress, and deliberately created spaces of freedom outside the reach of Nazi supervision. In the industrial Rhineland, particularly in Cologne and Dusseldorf, they engaged in direct clashes with Hitler Youth patrols, beating up HJ members who tried to enforce the regime's authority over young people. As the war went on and the Gestapo's attention intensified, some Edelweiss pirates moved from passive resistance to active sabotage, sheltering army deserters and escaped forced laborers, stealing supplies from Wehrmacht depots, and in some documented cases, planning attacks on Nazi officials and facilities. The Cologne Group, which had connections to a broader urban resistance network, was particularly active in the final years of the war. In November 1944, the Gestapo arrested and publicly hanged 13 members of the Cologne resistance network, including several Edelweiss pirates, among them Bartholomäus Schinck, known as Barthel, who was just 16 years old. The public hanging was intended as a deterrent, a demonstration of the consequences of resistance. Instead, it has become a permanent monument to the courage of those who refuse to be broken by the most totalitarian youth program in modern history. After the war, the Edelweiss pirates received little recognition for their resistance. For decades, they were largely forgotten, their story overshadowed by the more ideologically coherent narrative of groups like the White Rose. It was not until the late 20th century that German historians and filmmakers began to properly acknowledge the pirates' contribution, and it was only in 2005 that the city of Cologne formally recognized the Edelweiss pirates as resistance fighters, offering a belated apology for the years of official silence about their fate. For those who survived, the post-war recognition came late, but it was no less meaningful for that. The fate of the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, is a chapter of the Hitler Youth story that has received less attention than the male side of the organization, but is no less significant and no less complex. At its peak, the BDM had a membership of over 3 million girls between the ages of 14 and 18, with a further 2 million in the younger Jung Mädelbund. These girls were not being trained to fight in the conventional military sense, although that too would come in the final stages of the war. They were being shaped into what the Nazi ideology defined as ideal German women. Healthy, physically fit, racially pure, devoted to motherhood and domestic life, and utterly committed to the fatherland. The BDM's program combined physical exercise, home economics, ideological instruction, and a good deal of outdoor activity that many girls found genuinely enjoyable and liberating in its own perverse way. Former BDM members have spoken in memoirs and interviews of the genuine sense of community and purpose that membership provided, even as they have acknowledged the sinister ideology that underlay it all. The organization's leadership was overwhelmingly female, which gave many young women their first experience of holding authority and responsibility, albeit within the rigid constraints of Nazi ideology. Girls who rose through the ranks of the BDM found themselves managing substantial organizations, coordinating activities for hundreds of younger members, and developing leadership skills that would serve them in entirely different contexts after the war. As the war approached its catastrophic conclusion, the role of BDM members shifted dramatically. By 1944 and 1945, with Germany's cities under constant aerial bombardment and its civilian infrastructure crumbling, BDM girls were deployed in a wide range of auxiliary roles that the regime had previously reserved for adults. They served in air raid warning networks, worked in hospitals caring for the wounded, assisted in the evacuation of civilians from bombed-out cities, and performed a range of logistical and administrative functions that freed up men for military service. In the final stages of the war, some BDM members were assigned to anti-aircraft batteries, operating the communication and fire control equipment for flak guns. A smaller number found themselves directly in combat zones as Soviet forces advanced into German territory from the east, and some were killed. The experience of these young women in the final weeks of the war, of bombardment, of flight, of Soviet occupation with all its accompanying violence, was traumatic in ways that are difficult to overstate. The most educated estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of German women were subjected to sexual violence during and immediately after the Soviet advance into Germany, and BDM members in the wrong place at the wrong time were not exempt from this horror. For the girls and young women who survived and found themselves in the rubble of 1945, the process of rebuilding a life was complicated by the same ideological baggage that weighed down their male counterparts. They had been shaped by an organization that had defined their entire identity in terms of racial community and national sacrifice. Now, the racial community had collapsed in catastrophe, and national sacrifice had produced only death and destruction. The question of who they were without the BDM, without the ideology, without the framework of the Nazi state, was one that many of them found deeply difficult to answer. One of the most remarkable and in many ways most representative stories from the BDM's aftermath belongs not to a specific individual, but to a general pattern that emerged across post-war Germany. Research conducted in the 1950s and 1960s by sociologists and psychologists studying the adjustment of former BDM members to post-war life found that the vast majority had undergone remarkably rapid, apparent ideological transformation. Women who had been enthusiastic BDM members in 1944 were, by 1950, presenting themselves as ordinary housewives and working women who had simply done what the times required. The depth of this transformation was a matter of considerable debate among researchers. Some argued that the denazification process, combined with the practical demands of rebuilding lives in a shattered country, had genuinely shifted attitudes. Others were more skeptical, arguing that the apparent transformation was largely performative, a social adaptation to new circumstances rather than a genuine change of conviction. The truth, as is usually the case with human behavior, was probably somewhere in between and varied enormously from individual to individual. What is clear is that the BDM, like the Hitlerjugend proper, produced a generation that carried the weight of its upbringing in complex and lasting ways, and that understanding what happened to its members requires looking far beyond the official records of denazification proceedings. 1. Of the most dramatic and least well-known chapters in the story of the Hitler Youth's post-war fate is the story of Operation Werewolf. In the autumn of 1944, as it became increasingly clear that Germany might face military defeat, Heinrich Himmler and the SS leadership began organizing a stay-behind guerrilla network that would continue fighting behind Allied lines after Germany's conventional forces had been defeated. This network was given the name Werewolf, invoking the old German folklore about creatures that transform from human to beast. The Werewolf program was intended to be a serious partisan warfare operation, modelled loosely on the kind of resistance that Germany itself had faced from partisans in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe. It was to be staffed in large part by specially selected and fanatically committed Hitler Youth members, who would be trained in sabotage, assassination, and guerrilla tactics before being embedded in occupied German territory to carry out operations against the advancing Allies. The reality of Werewolf fell far short of the terrifying vision Himmler had conjured. The program suffered from inadequate preparation, poor organization, and most fundamentally, from a shortage of genuine volunteers willing to sacrifice their lives for a cause that was visibly collapsing. Some operations were carried out. In March 1945, Werewolf operatives assassinated Franz Oppenhoff, the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, in an operation that briefly seemed to validate the program's potential. Scattered acts of sabotage and occasional ambushes were carried out in various areas of occupied Germany. But the wholesale uprising that the program's architects had envisioned never materialized. Most of the young Hitler Youth members who had been recruited into Werewolf units simply melted away when the moment came, discarding their weapons and their identities and making their way home as best they could. The failure of Werewolf was in one: sense a relief for the occupying Allied forces, who had genuinely feared the prospect of a prolonged guerrilla war, but it was also a revelation about the limits of even the most intense ideological indoctrination. When faced with the choice between dying for a destroyed regime and trying to survive, the great majority of Hitler Youth members, even the most carefully selected Werewolf recruits, chose survival. The handful who did follow through with Werewolf operations were hunted down by Allied military police and intelligence units. Some were captured and tried, receiving sentences ranging from imprisonment to death. Others were shot out of hand during or after their operations. The Werewolf program claimed perhaps a few dozen lives on the Allied side across its entire operational existence, a pathetically small return on the enormous investment of resources and ideology that had gone into creating it. But the fear of Werewolf had real consequences, contributing to the harshness of early Allied occupation policies and reinforcing the determination of the occupying powers to carry out a thorough denazification of German society, including its youngest members. The process of denazification, as applied to Hitler Youth members, was one of the most complex and in many ways most inadequate aspects of the entire post-war settlement. The occupying powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, faced a challenge of almost incomprehensible scale. The Hitler Youth had 8 million members. The BDM had 3 million more. These were not secret participants in a clandestine organization. They were the overwhelming majority of German young people between the ages of 10 and 18, membership having been legally compulsory since 1939. To subject all of them to formal denazification proceedings was simply impossible. The Allied approach was therefore to focus formal proceedings on those who had held leadership positions or who were suspected of specific crimes, while relying on a broader process of education and social transformation to address the rank and file. In the American zone, this broader process took the form of re-education programs designed to introduce democratic values and expose young Germans to the full horror of what their country had done. American military government officers worked with German educators to develop new curricula that emphasized democracy, human rights, and an honest reckoning with the Nazi past. They organized visits to concentration camps for Hitler Youth members and other young people, forcing them to confront the physical reality of the Holocaust. They screened films documenting Nazi crimes. They worked to replace the Hitler Youth's leadership structure with new youth organizations based on democratic principles. The results were mixed. Some young people responded with genuine horror and a sincere commitment to building something different. Others remained in the grip of the ideology they had been raised in, dismissed what they were being shown as Allied propaganda, and retreated into a defensive nationalism that denied or minimized German guilt. The Soviet zone, which would become the German Democratic Republic, took a different approach. The East German Communist government drew a sharp distinction between fascism, which it defined as the instrument of monopoly capitalism, and the German people, who it claimed had been victims and not perpetrators of Nazism. This allowed for a kind of collective absolution that avoided the uncomfortable questions about popular support for Hitler and the Hitler Youth, and it produced a society in which the Nazi past was officially condemned, but privately and selectively remembered in ways that were far from honest. In West Germany, the denazification process gradually wound down in the early 1950s as the imperatives of the Cold War took over. The Western powers needed a rearmed West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and that meant accepting back into respectable society many people whose Nazi credentials were deeply compromising. Former Hitler Youth members who had committed no specific crimes faced no formal legal barrier to employment, education, or public life. The speed with which many former members of the Hitler Youth and other Nazi organizations were reabsorbed into the fabric of West German society is one of the most startling aspects of the post-war period, and it produced a generation of leaders, professionals, and public figures whose Hitler Youth past was either known and ignored or actively concealed. Perhaps no individual better illustrates this complex post-war trajectory than Helmut Kohl, who served as Chancellor of West Germany from 1982 to 1990, and then as Chancellor of the reunified Germany from 1990 to 1998, making him the longest-serving post-war German Chancellor and one of the dominant figures of late 20th century European politics. Kohl was born on April 3, 1930, in Ludwigshafen am Rhein, the son of a Catholic civil servant. He joined the Hitlerjugend as a young boy, as virtually every German boy of his generation was required to do. He has spoken in later life about the conflicted experience of HJ membership, and unlike some of his contemporaries, he did not attempt to entirely erase this aspect of his past. Kohl had the advantage of having been born in 1930, which meant he was just 15 at the end of the war, old enough to have been shaped by the Hitler Youth, but young enough that his involvement could reasonably be characterized as that of a child caught up in circumstances beyond his control. In the chaotic last weeks of the war, Kohl was briefly conscripted into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia that included boys as young as 12 alongside elderly men, but the war ended before he saw combat. After the war, Kohl pursued education and politics with single-minded determination, becoming a prominent figure in the Christian Democratic Union and ultimately achieving the highest political office in the country. His chancellorship was defined by his commitment to European integration and his role in the peaceful reunification of Germany, achievements that placed him alongside Konrad Adenauer as one of the founding figures of the modern German democratic state. His Hitler Youth past was never entirely forgotten, but it was relegated to a footnote in a career that was defined by its post-war democratic commitments. Kohl died on June 16, 2017, in Ludwigshafen am Rhein at the age of 87, mourned across Europe as a statesman who had helped build a different Germany from the ruins of the one he had been born into. His story raises a question that echoes throughout the history of the Hitler Youth's post-war generation. At what point does a person's past cease to define them, and who gets to answer that question? Another famous figure whose Hitler Youth membership became a significant public issue much later in his life was Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI in 2005. Ratzinger was born on April 16, 1927, in Markel am Inn in Bavaria, the son of a rural police officer who was a committed Catholic and an opponent of Nazism. Joseph and his elder brother Georg grew up in a household that was explicitly critical of the Nazi regime, and both boys attended seminary rather than regular schools, which gave them some insulation from the full weight of HJ indoctrination. Nevertheless, Joseph Ratzinger was enrolled in the Hitlerjugend at 14, as required by law, and attended meetings for a period before his seminary studies provided a legitimate basis for reduced attendance. His membership was not enthusiastic, and both he and his family regarded it as an unavoidable legal obligation rather than a genuine expression of ideological commitment. He was later briefly conscripted into an anti-aircraft unit and an infantry division before deserting in April 1945 in the chaotic final weeks of the Vietnam War, a dangerous act that could have resulted in his execution. He was briefly held as a prisoner of war by American forces before being released in June 1945. Ratzinger went on to pursue an academic and ecclesiastical career of extraordinary distinction, becoming a professor of theology, then Archbishop of Munich and Freising, then prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Church's most powerful doctrinal body, and finally, Pope. When he was elected to the papacy in April 2005, his Hitler Youth membership was immediately raised in international media coverage, prompting a careful and somewhat defensive response from the Vatican and from Ratzinger himself. His supporters argued, with considerable justification, that his membership had been essentially involuntary, and that his family's genuine opposition to Nazism placed him in a very different moral position from those who had joined the HJ out of genuine conviction. His critics argued that the episode deserved more than a brief defensive explanation, that it warranted genuine engagement with the broader question of how German society had allowed itself to be so comprehensively captured by National Socialism. The controversy subsided relatively quickly, but it left a mark on his pontificate and contributed to a broader public conversation about how Germany's Hitler Youth generation had processed, or failed to process, the meaning of their youth. Pope Benedict XVI resigned the papacy on February 28, 2013, an unprecedented step in modern church history, and died on December 31, 2022 in Vatican City at the age of 95. His Hitler Youth membership remains one of the more discussed aspects of a complex and consequential life. Günter Grass, one of the most celebrated German writers of the 20th century and winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1999, provided perhaps the most dramatic and most publicly shocking late revelation of a Hitler Youth past. Grass was born on October 16, 1927 in Danzig, now Gdansk in Poland, the son of a grocer of mixed German and Polish Kashubian heritage. He grew up in the tense cultural atmosphere of the free city of Danzig, a place caught between German nationalism and the realities of the post-Versailles world, and he was profoundly shaped by those tensions. Grass was enrolled in the Hitler Jugend, and by his own later account was an enthusiastic member, drawn by the adventure, the camaraderie, and the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. At 17, he volunteered for submarine service but was rejected, and instead found himself drafted in the autumn of 1944 into the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, an elite Waffen-SS formation. For over 60 years, Grass never publicly disclosed his SS membership. He built one of the most distinguished literary careers in post-war German letters, winning the Nobel Prize in part for his relentless engagement with German guilt and the Nazi past, most famously in his 1959 masterpiece, The Tin Drum. He was one of West Germany's most prominent public intellectuals, consistently calling on his compatriots to face honestly the darkest chapters of their history. And all the while he was concealing the most compromising chapter of his own. In August 2006, just months before the publication of his memoir Peeling the Onion, Grass revealed for the first time that he had been a member of the Waffen-SS. The revelation caused a sensation in Germany and internationally, and provoked a storm of criticism from those who felt that a man who had made German self-examination a cornerstone of his public identity had no right to have concealed his own SS membership for so long. Grass defended himself by explaining that he had felt shame, that he had processed the experience and found it too difficult and too compromising to disclose. His critics were largely unmoved. The Nobel Committee and many of Grass's literary admirers continued to respect his literary achievement, while acknowledging that his delayed disclosure was a serious failing. The episode became one of the most debated examples of the way in which the Hitler Youth generation had handled its past, the tension between the genuine transformation that many former members underwent and the accommodations and evasions that even the most publicly self-critical of them sometimes made. Günter Grass died on April 13, 2015 in Lübeck, at the age of 87. His legacy remains contested, but his literary achievement is secure. The story of Karl-Heinz Böhm provides yet another perspective on what the Hitler Youth generation did with their lives after the war ended and the ideology collapsed. Böhm was born on March 16, 1928 in Darmstadt, the son of the eminent conductor Karl Böhm, one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, and a man who had accommodated himself to the Nazi regime with troubling ease. Karl-Heinz grew up in a privileged household defined by high culture and the peculiar moral ambiguities of the artistic establishment under National Socialism. He joined the Hitlerjugend as required and emerged from the war at the age of 17 with his world in ruins and his values profoundly shaken. In the post-war years, he became an actor, achieving international fame in 1960 when he played the disturbed photographer Mark Lewis in Michael Powell's controversial British thriller Peeping Tom. But it was not his acting career that came to define Karl-Heinz Boom's legacy. In 1981, he made a televised bet with the German public on a popular television program, wagering that the majority of viewers would not donate to famine relief in Africa. He lost the bet, and the experience transformed him. He founded the organization Mention for Mention, People for People, which over the following decades raised hundreds of millions of euros for development projects in Ethiopia. The organization drilled wells, built schools, trained medical workers, and transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Boom spent a significant portion of his later life in Ethiopia, becoming one of the most respected development aid workers of his generation. He died on May 29, 2014, in Grudig in Austria, at the age of 86. His life represents one of the most dramatic possible trajectories available to a member of the Hitler Youth generation, from a childhood shaped by racial ideology to an old age dedicated to the practical work of human solidarity across the racial boundaries that ideology had proclaimed insurmountable. The fate of Hitler Youth members who pursued military careers in the post-war period raises some of the most complex questions in this entire story. When the Federal Republic of Germany established the Bundeswehr in 1955 as part of the NATO alliance and in response to the perceived Soviet threat, it faced an immediate practical problem. Where were the experienced officers and NCOs to come from? The only people in Germany who had real military experience were those who had served in the Wehrmacht and the SS, the very forces that had waged Hitler's war of conquest and genocide. The solution adopted by the new West German military was to recruit experienced veterans while theoretically excluding those with serious war crimes, charges against them. In practice, this line was drawn far less firmly than the official policy suggested. The Bundeswehr's early officer corps included a significant number of former Wehrmacht officers, and some of these had Hitler Youth backgrounds that were extensive and formative. The East German National People's Army, the National Volksarmee or NVA, faced the same basic problem and adopted a similar pragmatic solution, though it dressed it in the language of class rather than nationality, drawing a distinction between officers who had served the working class and officers who had served fascist capitalism. In both Germanies, in other words, the military institutions of the post-war period were built at least in part on a foundation of men whose formative experiences had been shaped by the Hitler Youth and its ideology. The degree to which those experiences continue to influence the culture and practices of the new military institutions is a question that German military historians have been examining with increasing thoroughness in recent decades, and the answers are not always reassuring. One of the most remarkable and least known careers launched by a former Hitler Youth member belongs to a man who went on to become one of the most important figures in post-war German intelligence. Reinhard Gehlen was not himself a Hitler Youth member, being born in 1902 and therefore a generation older, but the organization he built, the Gehlen organization, and its successor, the Bundesnachrichtendienst or BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence service, recruited heavily from the pool of young men who had served in the Wehrmacht and, by extension, who had been shaped by the Hitler Youth. Gehlen had been the head of Foreign Armies East, the Wehrmacht's intelligence section responsible for assessing Soviet military capabilities, and had the foresight to preserve his extensive files on Soviet intelligence networks. He offered these files to American intelligence immediately after the war, and the deal he struck with the newly formed CIA gave him extraordinary leverage in building the post-war German intelligence apparatus. The men who staffed the Gehlen organization in its early years included former Wehrmacht officers, some former SS men, and a cohort of younger men who had been Hitler Youth members as teenagers and had then transitioned into military intelligence during the war. The Gehlen organization's operations during the early Cold War period, including its extensive use of former Nazi collaborators and its penetration of émigré anti-communist organizations, has been the subject of considerable historical controversy. What is not in dispute is that it represented one of the most direct continuities between the Nazi state and the post-war Federal Republic. a pipeline through which the experiences, and in some cases, the personnel of the Third Reich's intelligence and military services were fed directly into the new democratic state. How did the ordinary members of the Hitler Youth, the millions who held no leadership positions and committed no documented atrocities, make sense of their experience after the war? This question, which might seem too diffuse and too psychological to yield historical answers, has in fact been addressed in considerable depth by researchers, memoirists, and oral history projects over the past 7 decades. What emerges from this body of evidence is a picture of enormous psychological complexity and tremendous variation. Some former members experienced something close to an instant ideological transformation, confronted by the evidence of the Holocaust and the ruins of the war they had been taught to believe in. For these people, the revelation of what the regime they had served had actually done was a profound moral shock, and the process of working through that shock shaped the rest of their lives in fundamental ways. Others processed their experience through a more defensive mechanism, acknowledging that the regime had done terrible things while maintaining that they personally had known nothing about the worst of it, had been too young to understand, had simply done what was required of them. This narrative of personal innocence combined with collective guilt became, in various forms, one of the defining features of how the Hitler Youth generation talked about its past. It was not necessarily dishonest. Many of those who offered it were genuinely trying to understand their own experience honestly, but it had the effect of diffusing moral responsibility in ways that could be convenient. A third pattern, more common among those who had held leadership positions or who had been more deeply involved in the ideological side of the organization, was a more explicit defensiveness that sometimes shaded into continued sympathy for nationalist ideas, if not for Nazism itself. This pattern was more common in the 1950s and faded gradually through the 1960s and 1970s as the generation that had grown up after the war began to ask more insistent questions about their parents' and grandparents' choices. The sociologist Heinz Budde, who conducted extensive interviews with former Hitler Youth members in the 1980s, described the generation as the Deutsche Karrieren, the German careers generation, people whose early ideological formation had been catastrophically derailed but who had nonetheless managed to construct successful lives in the post-war Federal Republic, often by channeling the organizational energy and sense of mission that the Hitler Youth had instilled in them into the project of rebuilding Germany. This was a generation, Budde argued, that was extraordinarily practical and achievement-oriented, that worked extraordinarily hard at building careers and institutions, partly because hard work and achievement provided a moral framework that replaced the discredited ideology of their youth, and partly because the act of building something concrete and useful provided psychological shelter from the more troubling questions about what their generation had done and believed. This is a compelling and thoughtful analysis, and it helps explain why so many former Hitler Youth members became prominent and productive citizens in post-war Germany, without apparently feeling a constant need to publicly reckon with their pasts. The psychological economics of survival had their own logic, and for many people in this generation, the most effective way to live with the past was to focus intensely on the present. One figure who represents yet another trajectory from the Hitler Youth is Joachim Peiper, known in English as Joachim Peiper, who became one of the most controversial and most prosecuted former members of the Waffen-SS in the post-war period. Peiper was born on January 30th, 1915 in Berlin and joined the Hitlerjugend in 1930 at the age of 15, becoming one of its early enthusiastic members before transitioning at 18 into the SS, where he served as personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler before moving to a combat role in the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the elite formation that also provided the cadre for the later Hitlerjugend division. Peiper proved to be one of the most gifted and aggressive armoured commanders in the entire German military. His tank regiment earned a fearsome reputation on the Eastern Front, where it was involved in a series of atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war that would have justified war crimes charges on their own. But it was a single operation in the Ardennes in December 1944 that made Peiper's name synonymous with SS brutality in the Western Allied consciousness. During the Eynar Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive in the West, Peiper commanded the spearhead battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division as it drove through the Belgian Ardennes attempting to reach the Meuse River. On December 17, 1944, near the small Belgian crossroads of Malmedy, soldiers of Piper's battle group captured approximately 84 American prisoners of war and massacred them in a field. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, was the worst atrocity committed against American troops in the Western European theatre, and it made Piper one of the most sought-after war crimes defendants of the immediate post-war period. He was tried in 1946 by a US military tribunal at the former Dachau concentration camp, along with 72 other members of his battle group. The trial resulted in death sentences for Piper and 42 others, with the remainder receiving prison sentences. However, the death sentences were never carried out. A subsequent investigation found that some of the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions had involved improper coercion, and in the political climate of the late 1940s, with the Cold War intensifying and the need for West German cooperation growing more urgent, there was considerable pressure to reduce the sentences. Piper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1951, and he was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956. After serving less than 11 years for the murder of 84 prisoners of war and countless other crimes across the length of Europe. After his release, Piper had difficulty finding steady employment in West Germany. His name was too notorious, his crimes too well remembered in the countries where they had occurred. He eventually settled in Travesse, a small village in the Haute-Saône region of eastern France near the German border, where he lived quietly under his own name and worked as a translator for the German car manufacturer Porsche. His presence in France eventually became known, and in the summer of 1976, 30 years after his trial and 20 years after his release, French communists and resistance veterans began a campaign to drive him out. On the night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, the eve of Bastille Day, Piper's house at Travesse was set on fire. Piper died in the blaze, apparently caught inside the burning building. He was 61 years old. Whether his death was murder, suicide, or accident has never been conclusively established. The perpetrators were never identified or prosecuted. His story encapsulates many of the deepest tensions of post-war Europe's reckoning with Nazism. The inadequacy of legal punishment, the persistence of memory in those communities that had suffered, and the impossibility of simply moving on from crimes of such magnitude. What happened to the Hitler Youth members who ended up in Soviet captivity is a story that unfolded very differently from those of their counterparts captured by the Western Allies. The Soviet Union had no interest in denazification in the Western sense. It had lost between 27 and 30 million people in the war against Nazi Germany, and its approach to German prisoners was shaped by a combination of ideological analysis, the demands of post-war reconstruction, and a desire for retribution that was entirely understandable, even when the specific methods it produced were not. Hitler Youth members captured by Soviet forces during the war or in its immediate aftermath faced a grim prospect. The majority were sent to camps in the Soviet Union where conditions were brutal. Malnutrition, disease, forced labor, and arbitrary violence killed an enormous number. Estimates of the total death rate among German prisoners in Soviet captivity range from 15 to 25%, which translates to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 deaths. For Hitler Youth members who had been captured in the final months of the war while still in their teens, the prospect of years in Soviet captivity was particularly devastating. Many of them spent their formative post-adolescent years in camps where survival was a full-time occupation that left little room for ideological reflection or psychological adjustment. The survivors who were eventually repatriated, the last German prisoners of war, did not return from the Soviet Union until 1955 and 1956, faced the additional challenge of re-entering a German society that had already moved on from the immediate post-war period and was engaged in the rather different project of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Some of these returning prisoners found that their families had assumed they were dead and had rebuilt their lives accordingly. Others found that the world they had left as teenagers was utterly unrecognizable. The psychological damage inflicted by years of brutal captivity, on top of the already traumatic experience of war and ideological collapse, was severe and frequently permanent. One of the most important and least discussed aspects of the Hitler Youth's post-war story involves the fate of those members who had committed specific crimes during the war and who faced prosecution decades after the events themselves. The late trials of former Waffen-SS members who had served in divisions that recruited from the Hitler Youth illustrate the painfully slow pace at which German society came to terms with the crimes committed in its name. The prosecution of former members of the Hitler-Jugend division for the murders at Abbé d'Ardennes continued for decades after the original Kurt Meyer trial. German prosecutors worked doggedly through the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s trying to build cases against individuals who had been identified as participants in specific killings. The challenge was enormous. Witnesses had died, memories had faded, and the accused had become respectable citizens of the Federal Republic who presented themselves as ordinary veterans caught up in the confusion of war. Many of these cases collapsed or ended in acquittals. A few resulted in convictions, though the sentences were typically light. The broader problem was one that German justice has struggled with throughout the post-war period: the gap between the scale of the crimes committed and the capacity of the legal system to deliver proportionate accountability. 8 million Hitler Youth members, 3 million BDM members, hundreds of thousands of Waffen-SS veterans. The number of people who bore some degree of moral, if not always legal responsibility, for what the Third Reich had done was so large that the legal system could only ever prosecute a tiny fraction of them. The rest lived out their lives in the society their generation had created and then destroyed, carrying their memories and their accommodations with those memories in private. The international dimension of the Hitler Youth's post-war diaspora is a story that takes us far beyond the borders of Germany and Austria. A significant number of former HJ members who had committed specific crimes or who feared prosecution for their wartime activities chose to flee Germany rather than face the uncertain consequences of denazification. The escape routes available to such people became known collectively as the rat lines, a term derived from the lines on a ship along which rats escape when it begins to sink. The rat lines were not a single organised system, but rather a network of overlapping escape mechanisms that typically relied on Catholic Church institutions, sympathetic right-wing networks, false document providers, and willing host countries in South America and the Middle East. The most famous of the rat lines ran through Rome, where certain church figures provided shelter and documentation to fleeing Nazis, and then on to Spain and Portugal, from where transatlantic passage could be arranged. Argentina, under the Peronist government that was ideologically sympathetic to fascism and eager to recruit technically skilled immigrants, was the most important destination. Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and several other South American countries also received former Nazis. Some of these were senior SS and party figures who had committed crimes on an enormous scale. Others were more junior figures, young men who had been committed Hitler Youth leaders who had participated in atrocities as members of the Waffen-SS, or who simply feared that their pasts would catch up with them in occupied Germany. The story of how these men established themselves in their new homes, raising families, building businesses, and in some cases continuing to organize politically in support of neo-Nazi causes, is one of the darker chapters of post-war history. Some of them were eventually tracked down by Nazi hunters, most notably the team associated with Simon Wiesenthal, or by Israeli intelligence, and were brought back to face justice. Others died peacefully in their adopted countries, taking their secrets to the grave. The number of former Hitler Youth members specifically who used the rat lines is impossible to establish with precision, but given that the Waffen-SS divisions that recruited from the HJ had tens of thousands of members, and that a significant number of these men sought to escape Germany at the war's end, the numbers were certainly in the thousands. The story of Erich Priebke is instructive as an example of what happened to former members of the Nazi apparatus who successfully escaped to South America and then lived quietly for decades before justice finally caught up with them. Priebke was born on July 29, 1913 in Hennigsdorf near Berlin and served as a police and SS officer in occupied Italy during the war. In March 1944, he participated directly in the Ardeatine massacre, in which 335 Italian civilians were murdered in caves outside Rome in retaliation for a partisan attack. After the war, Priebke escaped through the church-assisted rat lines to Argentina, where he settled in the Andean resort town of Bariloche and lived as a respected member of the local German émigré community for nearly 50 years. He was not himself a Hitler Youth member, being too old, but his story represents the arc that many younger former HJ members who had committed crimes sought to follow. He was eventually discovered and extradited to Italy, where he was convicted of murder and placed under house arrest, dying in Rome in 2013 at the age of 100, the last of the perpetrators of the Ardeatine massacre to face justice. For every Priebke who was eventually brought to account, there were many more who were never found, who died in comfortable obscurity thousands of miles from the scenes of their crimes. One of the more surprising and in some ways more redemptive threads running through the post-war story of the Hitler Youth involves the significant number of former members who became leaders in German religious life, specifically in the Catholic and Protestant churches. The post-war German churches, particularly the Catholic Church, played a complex and sometimes contradictory role in this period. On one hand, church institutions and individual clergy had provided refuge for some fleeing Nazis through the rat lines. On the other hand, the churches had also been among the primary sites of resistance to total Nazi control during the Third Reich, and they now represented one of the few institutional frameworks that had survived the collapse of the Nazi state with some degree of moral authority intact. Young people who had been through the Hitler Youth and were now trying to make sense of what they had believed and done found in religious conversion or intensified religious commitment a powerful mechanism for processing guilt and rebuilding an identity. The pattern of former HJ members finding their way into seminary or religious orders in the immediate post-war period was remarked upon by contemporary observers across the church spectrum. For some of these individuals, religious life provided an authentic spiritual journey of repentance and transformation. For others, it may have offered a more convenient social shelter, a world in which the difficult questions about the past could be held at arm's length by the demands of liturgy and community. Joseph Ratzinger's path through the seminary to the papacy is the most famous example of this pattern, but it was far from unique. In the world of German literature and the arts more broadly, the Hitler Youth generation left a complex and often deeply conflicted legacy. The generation that reached maturity in the rubble of 1945 produced some of the most important works in the post-war German cultural tradition, works that grappled directly and sometimes agonizingly with the questions of guilt, complicity, and identity that the war had forced upon their authors. Heinrich Böll, born in 1917 and winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1972, served in the Wehrmacht, and his post-war fiction was shaped by the experience of ordinary soldiers caught in a criminal war. Wolfgang Borchert, born in 1921, served on the Eastern Front, was imprisoned multiple times for anti-military remarks, and died in November 1947 at the age of 26, but not before writing the most powerful piece of German anti-war literature of the immediate post-war period, the radio play Draußen vor der Tür, The Man Outside, which captured the desperation and dislocation of the returning German soldier with a precision that has never been surpassed. Christa Wolf, born in 1929, was a BDM member before undergoing a profound political transformation and becoming one of the most important writers in the German Democratic Republic. Her 1976 novel, Kindheitsmuster, translated as Patterns of Childhood or A Model Childhood, is one of the most searching explorations of what it meant to grow up under Nazism and to spend a lifetime trying to understand what that upbringing had done to you. These writers and many others used literature as a form of public reckoning with the past, a way of asking questions about the Hitler Youth generation's experience and moral responsibility that could be posed more honestly in fiction than in public political discourse. Their work represents the best of what the generation produced, an unflinching willingness to look at the darkness and to try to understand it. The question of what happened to the Hitler Youth in the German Democratic Republic deserves separate attention, because the trajectory of former HJ members in East Germany was so different from that in the West. The communist government of the GDR built its legitimacy partly on the claim that it represented a complete break with Nazism, that it was the true anti-fascist Germany, while the West was a haven for former Nazis. This claim was not entirely without foundation. The SED, the Socialist Unity Party that governed East Germany, included genuine anti-fascists who had suffered under the Nazi regime, including communist resistors, Jewish survivors, and returned exiles. But the claim was also substantially dishonest. Many former Nazis and Nazi supporters had simply joined the SED after 1945 and were absorbed into the structures of the new state, their pasts conveniently forgotten in the interest of building the new socialist society. Former Hitler Youth members who came from working-class backgrounds and who had no specific crimes attached to their records found it relatively straightforward to join the Free German Youth, the Freie Deutsche Jugend, or FDJ, the GDR's own mass youth organization, and to begin building careers in the new state. The ideological demands were different: Marxism-Leninism instead of National Socialism, class struggle instead of racial struggle, Soviet big brothers instead of Germanic greatness. But the structural similarities between the Hitler Youth and the FDJ were not lost on observers, and some former HJ members reportedly found the transition surprisingly smooth. The same organizational competencies that had made a young man a good Hitler Youth leader could, with appropriate ideological adjustment, make him an effective FDJ functionary. The GDR produced its own version of the story of the Hitler Youth generation, one in which former members had been liberated by socialism from their fascist upbringing and transformed into builders of a better world. This narrative served useful political purposes and was not entirely false, but it was incomplete in ways that the GDR's own suppression of honest historical inquiry made it impossible to fully examine until after reunification in 1990. The story of Erich Honecker, who led the GDR from 1971 to 1989, is in this respect instructive, though his trajectory was in many ways unusual. Honecker was born on August 25, 1912, in Neunkirchen in the Saar, and grew up in a working-class family with strong communist sympathies. He joined the Communist Party of Germany as a young man and became a full-time party functionary, which meant that when the Nazis came to power in 1933, he went underground and was eventually arrested, spending 10 years in the Brandenburg-Gurden prison as a political prisoner before being liberated by Soviet forces in 1945. His trajectory was therefore the opposite of the typical Hitler Youth alumnus. Rather than being shaped by the Nazi youth movement and then trying to escape that shaping after the war, he had been imprisoned by the Nazi state and built his post-war identity on that experience of communist resistance. What is interesting about Honecker's case in the context of this discussion is that the organization he built to mobilize East German youth, the FDJ, reproduced many of the structural and cultural features of the Hitler Youth, while officially rejecting its ideology root and branch. The FDJ's mass rallies, its uniforms, its emphasis on physical fitness and collective discipline, its integration of ideological instruction with outdoor and leisure activities all echoed the Hitler Youth in ways that reflected less a conscious imitation than the limited repertoire of forms available for mass youth mobilization in 20th century Germany. The children who grew up in the GDR were, in a sense, the grandchildren and sometimes the children of the Hitler Youth generation, and they were shaped by organizations and institutions that bore more of its legacy than the official ideology was willing to acknowledge. The impact of the Hitler Youth on German education and pedagogy in the post-war period is a dimension of the story that is frequently overlooked, but deeply important. The German education system that emerged from the rubble of 1945 was staffed, at least initially, largely by teachers who had worked in German schools during the Nazi period and who had, to varying degrees, integrated the Hitler Youth's ideology into their teaching. The denazification of the teaching profession was even more partial and unsatisfactory than denazification in other sectors, partly because there was an acute, practical shortage of trained teachers and removing too many of them would have left classrooms empty, and partly because the educational authorities, themselves staffed by people with complicated pasts, were not always motivated to pursue the process with full rigor. Research conducted from the 1960s onward found evidence that elements of the authoritarian pedagogy that had characterized Nazi-era education survived well into the post-war period, not as explicit Nazi ideology, but as habits of mind and practice, deference to authority, emphasis on collective obedience, a distrust of individual critical thinking. The educational reformers who attempted to introduce a genuinely democratic pedagogy into German schools faced resistance not only from conservative educators, but from the expectations of parents and students who had themselves been shaped by the Hitler Youth and its pedagogy. The process of transformation was slow, contentious, and never entirely complete, even as the official content of German education became one of the most thoroughgoing confrontations with the Nazi past anywhere in the world. By the 1960s, the generation that had grown up entirely in post-war Germany was beginning to ask its parents and grandparents harder questions than the previous decade had been comfortable with. The student movement of 1968, which shook West Germany along with France, the United States, and much of the Western world, had in the German context a particular edge of generational confrontation. Young West Germans demanded to know what their parents and teachers had done during the Nazi period, refused to accept evasions and accommodations, and identified the liberal establishment of the Federal Republic as complicit in a collective forgetting that they were determined to break open. The protests, the sit-ins, the confrontations that characterized the German student movement of 1968 were not only about Vietnam or university governance, but about the Hitler Youth generation's account of itself. The demand was for honest reckoning, for acknowledgement, for an end to the comfortable narrative in which most ordinary Germans had simply been bystanders to events they could not control. The Hitler Youth generation, now in middle age, and in many cases in positions of authority and influence, found this demand deeply uncomfortable. Some responded with genuine engagement and found the confrontation, however painful, ultimately valuable. Others responded defensively, retreating into the same narrative of necessity and ignorance that had served them throughout the post-war period. The generational conflict of 1968 was in many ways the Hitler Youth generation's most important trial, not a legal proceeding but a moral one conducted in public by the children it had raised. The outcome was not a verdict but a process, one that is still continuing today as Germany works through the implications of what its Hitler Youth generation did and how it subsequently lived with the memory of what it had done. The Flakhelfer generation, as it is sometimes called in German, represents a specific subset of the Hitler Youth experience that deserves dedicated attention. The Flakhelfer were young men, typically born between 1926 and 1929, who were assigned to man anti-aircraft batteries as auxiliary helpers beginning in 1943 as the Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified. These boys, aged 14 to 17, were withdrawn from school to serve alongside regular Luftwaffe crews at flak batteries across Germany, operating searchlights, fire control equipment, and occasionally the guns themselves. The experience was profoundly formative and deeply traumatic. They watched Allied bombers fall burning from the night sky. They saw German cities reduced to firestorms. They experienced the terror of combat at an age when they should have been sitting in classrooms, and they developed, in the compressed and intense environment of the flak battery, a kind of premature adulthood that left permanent marks. The Flakhelfer generation has been identified by historians as one of the most intellectually productive cohorts in post-war German cultural life. Among its members were some of the most distinguished scholars, writers, scientists, and public intellectuals of the Federal Republic. The list includes the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, born in 1929, who served as a Flakhelfer and went on to become one of the most influential thinkers in post-war European philosophy. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, born in 1929, one of Germany's most celebrated poets and essayists. Martin Walser, born in 1927, one of the most important West German novelists, and many others. The intense experiences of the Flakhelfer generation, combined with the shock of the regime's collapse and the subsequent process of re-education and democratic reconstruction, produced in many of these individuals an extraordinary intellectual seriousness and a lifelong engagement with the questions of politics, morality, and history that their wartime experiences had raised. Jürgen Habermas in particular has spoken in interviews and essays about the decisive impact of 1945 on his intellectual development. Watching the Nuremberg trials on film as a teenager, seeing the evidence of what the Third Reich had done laid out in documentary footage, was for Habermas a pivotal moment of moral awakening that shaped his entire philosophical project, his lifelong commitment to building a rational, communicative, democratic public sphere, capable of resisting the catastrophic irrationalism that had characterized National Socialism. The role of women in the post-war transformation of the Hitler Youth generation has been consistently underestimated in historical accounts. While the male members of the Hitler Youth and their post-war trajectories have received considerable scholarly and popular attention, the women who had been members of the BDM have been treated largely as a peripheral concern, their experience assumed to be less important because they had not been soldiers or war criminals. This assumption is deeply mistaken. The BDM had 3 million members at its peak, and these women experienced the collapse of the Nazi regime and the challenge of rebuilding their lives in circumstances that were in some ways even more difficult than those of their male counterparts. German women in the immediate post-war period faced not only the general challenges of hunger, homelessness, and political reconstruction, but also the specific consequences of the mass sexual violence that had accompanied the Soviet advance, consequences that affected hundreds of thousands of women directly and millions more through the fear and shame that surrounded it. BDM women who had been raised to think of themselves as guardians of racial purity and bearers of the next generation of the master race found themselves in a world in which the racial categories they had been taught were not merely discredited, but were actively associated with the worst atrocities in human history. The challenge of rebuilding an identity from that wreckage was immense. Some former BDM members found a path forward through political engagement. A number became active in the nascent democracy of the Federal Republic, joining political parties, working in civic organizations, and eventually reaching positions of some prominence. Ruth Hermann Fischler, born in 1928, was a BDM member who became a leading figure in German social work and wrote extensively in the 1970s and 1980s about her experience of both the BDM and its aftermath, becoming one of the earliest and most candid public voices of the female Hitler Youth generation. Her willingness to discuss not only the crimes of the regime, but the genuine attractions that the BDM had held for her as a young woman, the sense of community, the physical freedom, the feeling of belonging to something important, represented an unusual level of honesty that stood out against the more defensive postures of many of her contemporaries. The academic study of the BDM and its long-term social impact received a major boost in the 1980s when a series of oral history projects began systematically collecting the testimonies of former members. These projects, conducted by researchers at universities across West Germany, produced an archive of voices that revealed the enormous variety of experiences within what had appeared from the outside to be a monolithic organization. Some women described genuine enthusiasm and lifelong nostalgia for the comradeship of their BDM years, even as they acknowledged the ideology that had shaped it. Others described coercion, bullying, the crushing of individuality, and a deep-seated resentment that had never fully dissipated. Many described something in between, a mixture of genuine positive experiences and growing discomfort, of real friendships formed within a context they had come to regard as shameful, of memories that could not simply be categorized as good or bad because they were, irreducibly, both. The children of former Hitler Youth members, the generation born in the late 1940s and 1950s, occupy a particularly painful position in this entire story. They grew up in households shaped by parents who carried the Hitler Youth experience in varying degrees of consciousness and acknowledgement. Some of these parents were honest with their children about what they had done and believed, engaging in the kind of generational conversation that the political upheavals of the 1960s would later force more widely. Most were not. The silence that characterized many German households in the 1950s regarding the Nazi past was not universal, but it was common enough to have become one of the defining features of post-war German family culture. Children picked up fragmentary information, caught the silences and evasions, formed impressions that did not quite cohere into understanding. When the student movement of 1968 broke the silence in public, it also broke it in private, in thousands of painful family conversations across West Germany, in which children confronted parents and grandparents with what they had learned and demanded honest answers. The answers they received were inevitably mixed. Some parents engaged with the questions honestly and found that the conversation, however painful, brought them closer to their children. Others retreated into denial, injured pride, or claims of having simply done what everyone had done. The rifts these conversations opened in German families in the late 1960s and 1970s were real and lasting, and their consequences rippled forward through subsequent generations. The legal reckoning with the crimes of the Waffen-SS formations that had been built from Hitler Youth personnel continued far longer than most people realize. It was not until the late 1990s that German courts finally convicted significant numbers of former Waffen-SS members for their wartime crimes, and even then, the scale of the prosecutions was vanishingly small relative to the scale of the crimes. The investigation into the Malmedy massacre continued for decades after Piper's release, with German prosecutors examining the roles of individual soldiers who had been identified as participants. Most of these investigations were frustrated by the deaths of witnesses, the difficulty of establishing individual responsibility within mass actions, and the reluctance of German courts to move aggressively against elderly men, whose defense teams were often highly skilled. The case of Josef Schöngraber, a former SS officer who had participated in a massacre of Italian civilians in 1944, was not resolved until 2009 when he was convicted of murder at the age of 90 and sentenced to life imprisonment, making him one of the oldest people ever convicted of war crimes in Germany. His case showed both the persistence of German prosecutors, who refused to let the crimes of the Nazi era simply expire with the passage of time, and the extraordinary duration of the interval between crime and punishment that characterized so many of the late Nazi trials. Former Hitler Youth members who had gone on to commit specific crimes in the Waffen-SS and other formations were aware throughout their post-war lives that the legal clock had not stopped, that new evidence might emerge, that a determined prosecutor might one day knock on their door. For some, this awareness was a source of ongoing anxiety. For others, perhaps the majority, the conviction that they had outlasted the era of serious prosecution, combined with the practical reality that the burden of proof was extremely high, allowed them to live more or less undisturbed by legal consequences. The contemporary legacy of the Hitler Youth is a question that any honest history of the organization must address. We are now far enough removed from the events of the Second World War that the last surviving members of the Hitler Youth are in their late 80s and 90s, and most of them are gone. The generation that marched in those brown shirts and black uniforms, that sang those songs around campfires in the German forests, that fired anti-tank rockets at Allied soldiers in the ruins of German cities, is passing from the historical record into memory. What they leave behind is a set of questions, moral, psychological, and political, that have not yet received complete answers and may never do so. How deeply did the Hitler Youth's indoctrination penetrate? How much of the evil that the Third Reich committed was made possible by the ideological formation of the youth who carried it out? How much of the post-war democratic achievement of the Federal Republic was made by the same people, channeling the organizational energy and the sense of purpose that the Hitler Youth had instilled in them into entirely different projects? And what does the story of the Hitler Youth tell us about the vulnerability of young people to ideological capture, about the responsibility of adults to protect children from movements that would weaponize their natural need for belonging and purpose? These are not abstract questions. They are questions that every generation faces in its own context, and the answers given in Germany in the 20th century cast a long shadow over the answers being worked out in various forms today. The Hitler Youth was dissolved by order of the Allied Control Council in October 1945, formally abolished along with all other Nazi organizations. Its assets were seized, its publications banned, its symbols outlawed. The physical apparatus of the organization disappeared relatively quickly. The psychological apparatus, the beliefs, the habits, the identifications, the sense of what it meant to be German and young and male or female, dissolved far more slowly, if at all. The boys who had marched through German streets in their brown shirts, who had camped in the forests and learned to shoot and to hate, didn't become different people in May 1945. They became people who had to figure out how to live with who they had been and what they had done in a world that was asking them to build something different from the ruins. Some of them did this with extraordinary courage and genuine transformation. Some did it with pragmatic accommodation and careful forgetting. A small number refused to give up what they had believed and retreated into bitterness and continuing resentment. Most, as is the case with most human beings in most circumstances, occupied complicated and shifting positions somewhere among these possibilities. The story of the Hitler Youth after 1945 is ultimately a story about the limits of ideology, about the resilience and the malleability of human beings, and about the extraordinary difficulty of doing justice to the crimes of a past that involved, in one way or another, so many millions of ordinary people. It is a story without a clean ending, without a final verdict, without a moment at which the account can be closed and history can be said to have rendered its judgment. The last of the Hitler Youth generation is dying, and the questions they leave behind are being passed to their children and grandchildren, who must find their own ways of carrying them. The story of Max Mannheimer, born on February 6, 1920 in Neustadt an der Waag in what is now Slovakia, offers one final and perhaps the most important perspective in this entire account. Mannheimer was not a Hitler Youth member. He was the opposite, a Jewish teenager whose entire world was destroyed by the regime and the ideology that the Hitler Youth served. He survived 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau and Dachau, losing his parents, his wife, and his siblings to the Holocaust. After the war, he settled in Munich, and in the decades that followed, he devoted himself to one of the most demanding and most important tasks imaginable. Going into schools and meeting halls across Germany and talking to the children and grandchildren of the Hitler Youth generation about what had been done to him and to his people. He met former Hitler Youth members. He answered their questions. He watched them struggle with guilt, with shame, with the difficulty of reconciling what they had been taught with what they had done, with the knowledge of what had been committed in the name of the ideology they had been raised to revere. Mannheimer said in numerous interviews that he did not approach these encounters with hatred. He approached them with a determination that the truth should be told and heard, that the gap between perpetrators and victims should be bridged not by forgetting, but by honest witnessing. He was awarded the Bavarian Order of Merit and the Federal Cross of Merit for this work. He died on September 23, 2016, in Munich at the age of 96. His life and his testimony represent the necessary counterweight to any history of the Hitler Youth, a reminder that the question of what happened to the Hitler Youth after the war cannot be separated from the question of what happened to the millions of people who were targeted, persecuted, and murdered in the service of the ideology who the Hitler Youth embodied. The history of the perpetrators and the history of the victims are not separate stories. They are one story, and they can only be properly understood together. The legacy of the Hitler Youth extends forward in a more troubling direction as well. Neo-Nazi and far-right groups in Germany and elsewhere have consistently looked back to the Hitler Youth as a model for the ideological formation of young people, and in the years since German reunification, there has been periodic concern about the re-emergence of organised far-right youth activity in the eastern states of Germany, where the transition from the communist FDJ to the Free Society of Unified Germany left some young people in a vacuum of identity and purpose that extremist recruiters were quick to exploit. The German government has responded with a series of programs designed to counter extremist recruitment among young people. Programs that draw explicitly on the lessons of the Hitler Youth experience to argue that the most effective counter to ideological capture is not simple prohibition, but the provision of genuine community, genuine purpose, and genuine civic engagement. The Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, the Federal Agency for Civic Education, has published extensive educational materials on the Hitler Youth for use in German schools, materials that approach the subject with a directness and a depth of moral engagement that would have been impossible in the 1950s, and that reflects the long, difficult journey the Federal Republic has made toward an honest reckoning with its past. This educational work, carried out in classrooms and museums and memorial sites across Germany, is the most lasting and the most important response to the question of what happened to the Hitler Youth after the war. Not in the sense that it provides a final answer, but in the sense that it insists on the question being asked and answered honestly, generation after generation, for as long as the question retains its terrible relevance. And given human nature and human history, that may be a very long time indeed. The Hitler Youth at its height was an organisation that claimed to embody the highest ideals of a generation: courage, sacrifice, community, love of the fatherland, physical vitality, and devotion to a cause larger than the individual self. These ideals, which are recognisable because they echo genuine and permanent human needs, were placed in the service of a movement that channeled them toward racial hatred, imperial conquest, and industrialised mass murder. The young people who were shaped by this organisation were not born evil, and many of them emerged from its influence without becoming evil in any meaningful, permanent sense. But they were damaged, distorted, and sometimes made complicit in things they might have resisted had they been raised differently. Understanding what the Hitler Youth did to its members, and understanding what those members then did with the rest of their lives, requires holding together two things that are in constant tension: the full weight of the crimes committed in the name of the ideology these young people were taught, and the full humanity of the people who were taught it. Neither the easy condemnation that erases individual complexity nor the easy absolution that dissolves individual responsibility into historical circumstance does justice to the truth. What the story demands, and what the best historical and literary work on the subject has always sought to provide, is the patient and honest willingness to look at human beings in their full complexity, shaped by forces they did not choose, making choices within the constraints those forces imposed, and living with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. That is the story of the Hitler Youth after 1945. It is a story that is still being told, and it is a story that none of us can afford to stop listening to. The specific story of Alfons Heck provides one of the most detailed and candid first-hand accounts of what the Hitler Youth experience felt like from the inside, and what the transition to post-war reality demanded of those who had lived through it most intensely. Heck was born on April 28, 1928, in Wittlich in the Eifel region of Western Germany, a small-town boy who grew up in the specific provincial Catholic culture of the Rhineland. He joined the Jungvolk at age 10, as required by law, and quickly revealed a talent for leadership and organizational work that propelled him rapidly through the ranks of the Hitler Youth. By the age of 15, he was a Gefolgschaftsführer, a unit leader commanding about 150 boys, and by the end of the war, at 17, he had risen to the rank of Bannführer, responsible for the Hitler Youth in a district encompassing some several thousand members. Heck was not a peripheral or reluctant participant. He was, by his own later and agonized admission, a true believer. He believed genuinely and deeply in the ideology he had been taught, in the racial superiority of the German people, in the world historical mission of Adolf Hitler, in the glorious future that awaited a Germany purified of its enemies and freed from the shackles that the Treaty of Versailles had imposed. He believed it with the whole-hearted, uncritical fervour that only the very young can sustain, and he dedicated himself to spreading that belief to the boys under his command. The American capture of his district in March 1945 was for Heck not a liberation but a catastrophic personal defeat. He was 17 years old and everything he had believed in had collapsed. In the post-war years, he navigated the denazification process, was classified as a follower rather than an activist, and slowly rebuilt a life in the shattered Federal Republic. In 1961, he emigrated to Canada and eventually to the United States, where he built a successful career in journalism and media. It was in America, at a considerable geographical and temporal distance from Germany, that Heck began the process of writing honestly about his Hitler Youth experience, a process that consumed much of his mature life. His memoir, A Child of Hitler. Germany in the Days When God Wore a Swastika, published in 1985, was one of the most unflinching first-person accounts of what it meant to be raised by the Hitler Youth. Heck did not seek to minimize his own enthusiasm or his own complicity. He described in precise detail the process by which his mind had been shaped, the specific beliefs he had held, the specific actions he had taken, the specific moment when the collapse of May 1945 had forced him to begin questioning what he had believed. The book was uncomfortable reading precisely because of its honesty, because it refused the easy consolations of the narrative that said ordinary Germans had been ignorant victims of a criminal elite. Heck was ordinary. And Heck had believed. The book brought him into contact with Renee Firestone, a Jewish survivor of Auschwitz whose family had been murdered there, and the two eventually collaborated on a documentary film called Heil Hitler, Confessions of a Hitler Youth, which combined Heck's testimony with Firestone's and tried to place both in a historical context that could illuminate the connection between the world that had created Heck and the world that had attempted to destroy Firestone. The film won an Academy Award in 1991, and the collaboration between Heck and Firestone became in itself a kind of testimony, evidence that the gap between the world of Jo, the perpetrators, and the world of the victims could be bridged, at least in part, by honest confrontation with the truth. Alfons Heck died on February 14, 2005, in San Diego, California, at the age of 76. His willingness to tell his own story without self-serving evasion remains one of the most valuable gifts any member of the Hitler Youth generation gave to historical understanding. Another figure who contributed substantially to the public understanding of the Hitler Youth experience was Melita Maschmann, born on January 11, 1918, in Berlin, who joined the BDM in 1933 at the age of 15 and rose to a significant position within the organization before the war ended. Maschmann came from a bourgeois Berlin family that was not particularly political, and she described her initial attraction to the BDM as driven less by anti-Semitism or racial ideology than by a romantic nationalism, a desire to identify with a movement that seemed to be lifting Germany out of the humiliation of the Weimar period and restoring it to greatness. As she rose through the organization and encountered its ideology more systematically, she absorbed it more deeply, including its virulent anti-Semitism, in ways that she later found deeply disturbing when she examined them honestly. Her memoir, Account, Rendered, a dossier on my former self, published in German in 1963 and translated into English in 1964, was a remarkable exercise in retrospective self-examination. Written as an extended letter to a Jewish school friend from whom she had been separated by the Nazi persecution and whom she never saw again, the book tried to answer the question of how an intelligent, educated, and fundamentally decent young woman had managed to embrace an ideology that was destroying people she had liked and respected. Maschmann's analysis of her own self-deception, of the psychological mechanisms by which she had managed to maintain compartments in her mind that kept her knowledge of Nazi, anti-Semitic violence separate from her beliefs about the movement she served, is one of the most psychologically penetrating pieces of writing to emerge from the entire Hitler Youth generation. She argued that the ideological training of the BDM had been designed specifically to prevent the kind of connected thinking that would have allowed its members to link the abstract categories of racial ideology to the concrete experiences of real human beings. The Jews were presented as an abstract collective threat, not as individuals with faces, names, and families. When those individuals occasionally intruded on consciousness, as they did for Maschmann in her relationship with her Jewish school friend, the training provided mechanisms for containing and suppressing the contradiction. It was only after the war, confronted with the full documentation of what the regime had done, that those compartments broke down and the connections could no longer be avoided. The experience of the Hitler youth in the specific context of the Sudetenland, Austria, and the other territories that were incorporated into the Greater German Reich between 1938 and 1941 adds further dimensions to the story. When German forces occupied Austria in March 1938 in the Anschluss, the Austrian Hitler Youth, which had been operating in a semi-clandestine capacity since it was officially banned by the Austro-fascist government in 1933, suddenly became the official state youth movement. For Austrian boys and girls who had been secret members of the HJ, the Anschluss was a moment of triumphant vindication. They emerged from hiding to march in the streets of Vienna and Graz and Salzburg wearing the uniforms they had previously had to conceal. The enthusiasm was in many cases genuine, fed by years of illegal underground membership that had given it the additional emotional charge of forbidden commitment. Austrian members of the Hitler Youth would go on to serve in all the same formations as their German counterparts, including the Waffen-SS, and their post-war experiences followed similar patterns: denazification, re-education, absorption into civilian life, and the long private reckoning with what they had believed and done. The Austrian state's initial post-war narrative, which presented Austria as the first victim of Nazi aggression, rather than a willing participant in it, had the effect of making honest public examination of the Austrian Hitler Youth generation's experience even more difficult than in Germany. Because the official story required that the enthusiasm of 1938 be treated as either forced compliance or as the manipulation of a naive population by German propaganda. The Austrian reckoning with this narrative, which began in earnest only in the 1980s with the Waldheim affair, when it was revealed that President Kurt Waldheim had concealed his wartime service in a Wehrmacht unit implicated in Balkan atrocities, was delayed by decades relative to the German one, and, in some respects, has never been fully completed. The children who grew up in Nazi-occupied territories and who were enrolled in German-language Hitler Youth units present yet another dimension of the story. In the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, the Nazi racial hierarchy determined which young people were eligible for membership in the Hitler Youth and which were excluded. Ethnic Germans, or Volksdeutsche, living in Poland, the Czech Protectorate, and the occupied Soviet territories were actively recruited into the Hitler Youth, their German ethnicity making them eligible for a form of privilege that their neighbours were explicitly denied. For these young people, the post-war situation was particularly perilous because they were associated not only with the Nazi regime in general, but with a specific ethnic identity that had been weaponized in the service of conquest and occupation. After 1945, the ethnic German communities of Eastern Europe were subject to mass expulsion. Violence and dispossession as the nations that had been occupied took revenge on those who had collaborated with the occupiers. For ethnic German Hitler Youth members in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, the post-war experience was often one of flight, dispossession, and the loss of everything they had known, combined with the additional complexity of having been enthusiastic participants in the occupying regime's youth movement. The expulsion of the Sudetendeutsche from Czechoslovakia and the Volksdeutsche from Poland after 1945 created waves of refugees who arrived in Germany as an already traumatized country was struggling to absorb millions of other displaced persons. Their reception in Germany was often unwelcoming, their status ambiguous, their pasts both a source of vulnerability and, in some communities, of a bitter solidarity organized around shared grievance. The story of child soldiers in the Hitler Youth's final deployments in 1944 and 1945 raises questions that are still debated by historians, ethicists, and legal scholars today. At what point does a child in uniform cease to be a victim of the adults who put them there and become a perpetrator in their own right? The boys who manned Berlin's barricades in April 1945, who fired Panzerfausts at Soviet tanks, who in some documented cases executed German soldiers accused of defeatism or desertion under the orders of their SS supervisors, were acting within a context of total coercion. They had been raised since infancy in a system that allowed them no meaningful choice about their participation, and yet some of them committed acts that, in any neutral moral accounting, would be classified as crimes. The international legal framework for the treatment of child soldiers has developed enormously since 1945, partly in response to the experiences of the Second World War, and partly in response to the use of child soldiers in more recent conflicts in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which came into force in 2002, specifically identifies the conscription of children under 15 into armed forces as a war crime, a provision that was designed to address post-war conflicts, but that casts retrospective light on the Hitler Youth's final deployments as well. The question of how to understand the agency and responsibility of the child soldiers of 1945 is not merely a historical question, but a living ethical issue that has implications for how we think about childhood, indoctrination, and moral responsibility in any context. One final thread in this already complex tapestry is the story of the Hitler Youth members who became active in the peace movement and in international reconciliation efforts in the post-war decades. The experience of having been raised for war and of having seen that war's consequences at first hand produced in some former members a powerful revulsion from militarism and a commitment to building the peaceful, cooperative European order that their wartime experiences had made seem both necessary and possible. The founders and early leaders of the European Youth Campaign, launched in the early 1950s as part of the broader project of European integration, included some former Hitler Youth members alongside French, Dutch, Belgian, and British young people who had experienced the war from the other side. The encounters between former enemies in the context of European youth exchanges, which began in the late 1940s and became institutionalized through organizations like the Franco-German Youth Office established in 1963, were sometimes extraordinarily powerful precisely because they brought together people who had been raised to regard each other as racial enemies and allowed them to discover their common humanity. Former Hitler Youth members who participated in these exchanges often described them as transformative, as moments when the abstractions of ideology dissolved in the face of the concrete reality of other human beings who turned out to be disappointingly and wonderfully similar to themselves. These personal encounters, multiplied across thousands of individual cases, were the real mechanism through which the Hitler Youth generation's most formative beliefs were eroded and eventually replaced by the values of democratic citizenship. No amount of formal denazification could accomplish what genuine human contact accomplished, the simple, radical, subversive discovery that the supposed enemies were people. The memoir literature produced by the Hitler Youth generation is one of the most remarkable bodies of personal testimony in the history of the 20th century. Beyond the accounts of Alphonse Heck and Melita Mashman already discussed, dozens of other former members committed their experiences to paper in the post-war decades, and together these accounts constitute an extraordinary archive of interiority, a record not only of what happened to these people, but of how they understood and interpreted their own experience. What is striking about the best of this literature is the consistency with which former members describe the same essential experience of belief followed by disillusionment, of genuine investment in the organization's values, followed by the shattering recognition that those values had been used to serve purposes that were indefensible. Whether the memoirist was a girl from Hamburg who had loved the BDM's camping trips and found the ideology seeping in gradually through the activities she had enjoyed, or a boy from Munich who had marched and drilled and learned to hate with enthusiasm, the arc of the story tends to follow the same fundamental trajectory. Childhood innocence, adolescent idealism, ideological capture, the crescendo of war, collapse, and the long, difficult process of reconstruction. This consistency is both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it suggests that even the most thoroughgoing ideological capture is not permanent, that human beings retain the capacity for moral adjustment even when it is severely compressed. Troubling because the very consistency of the disillusionment narrative can serve as a kind of template for absolution, a story that former members could tell themselves and others that simultaneously acknowledge the wrong of Nazism and reposition the teller as its victim rather than its agent. The most honest of the memoirists were aware of this danger and tried to resist it. The least honest used the narrative framework to accomplish exactly the kind of protective self-presentation that the more courageous ones were trying to avoid. Reading the memoir literature as a whole, with attention to both its illuminating honesty and its defensive evasions, remains one of the most challenging and most rewarding exercises available to anyone trying to understand what the Hitler Youth was, what it did to its members, and what it means that the society which produced it was capable of rebuilding itself into one of the stable, prosperous democracies of the contemporary world. The specific fate of Hitler Youth members from minority groups within Germany itself adds yet another dimension of moral and historical complexity to this already multi-layered story. Germany in the 1930s was not an entirely ethnically homogeneous society, and the experiences of young people from marginalized groups who were nominally required to participate in the Hitler Youth reveal the specific cruelties of a racial state applied to the young. Young Sinti and Roma people, who were classified as racially inferior under Nazi racial law and were subject to increasing persecution through the 1930s, were explicitly excluded from the Hitler Youth, a fact that marked them as targets in their own communities and schools. Young Afro-German children, the so-called Rhineland bastards, offspring of German women and African colonial soldiers who had been stationed in the Rhineland after World War I, were similarly excluded and in some cases subjected to forced sterilization under the racial hygiene laws. For these young people, the Hitler Youth was not an organization that had captured and distorted their idealism. It was a symbol of the regime that marked them as less than human. The contrast between their experience and that of the young Germans who marched in those formations is one of the starkest available illustrations of what the Hitler Youth's ideology meant in practice, stripped of its romantic nationalism and its rhetoric of youth and strength, and revealed as what it actually was: a tool for the enforcement of racial hierarchy and the preparation of a racial war of conquest and annihilation. The survivors of these persecuted groups who outlived the Third Reich faced their own complex post-war challenges, including the long, painful, and often unsuccessful struggle for recognition of their suffering by a West German state that was slow to acknowledge non-Jewish victims of Nazi persecution, and even slower to provide them with the compensation and the official acknowledgement that justice required. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The story of the Hitler Youth is one of the most important and most sobering chapters in modern history. A reminder of what can happen when a society allows its youngest and most vulnerable members to be captured by a movement that weaponizes their need for belonging and purpose. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we explore even more of the extraordinary and complicated lives lived by those who grew up in the shadow of the Third Reich. Don't forget to like this video subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.